Hello, and welcome to episode 35 of That Encyclopedia podcast with your hosts Jacob and Will.
Hello.
It has been a little while since we've recorded one of our classic podcast episodes, and I apologise for that. That's down to some illness and personal things in my life at the moment, but we're back on course now, and to demonstrate how serious we are tackling one of the most important monarchs in all of European history, in my opinion, Louis XIV, also known as Louis the Great in France, or the Sun King sometimes as well, who ruled as the King of France from 1643 until his death in 1715 at the age of 76, which was not bad at all, actually, for a monarch of his time. Well, we decided to split this article in two, basically, didn't we? Because it is a chunky article which covers a lot of not only personal life and politics, biographical information, but also grand geopolitical strategies and wars and all sorts of tangents and rabbit holes everywhere you look. So we decided to take this from two different approaches and meet in the middle. What insights did you experience from reading the first sections of the article?
Yeah, so what I can do is I can try to give a bit of a summary. I don't think it should be too long. It might be a bit long, but I think it will also be broken up with some questions I have for you, and if you have any questions for me, I'll try my best to answer them, but I don't have nearly enough knowledge to talk on this topic. I mean, if you look at the size of this flipping Wikipedia page, you know, splitting it in half definitely helps, but there's still a lot. And the page itself is merely a summary. You know, there's links to all these separate events. Every single war has its own link. You've got all of these other sort of key figures in the king's life that will have their own biographies, all of their interactions with, you know, French politics and monarchy, everything going on around the scenes. So we'll start in the year 1638 in Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye, where King Louis XIII and Anne of Austria have led to the birth of this new Louis. So these two characters, along with a cardinal at the time, Cardinal Richelieu, were central figures that you may have heard of, aside from knowing about European monarchs. They are central figures in the famous Alexandre Dumas novel, The Three Musketeers. So this is a story that I'm sure anyone listening who is from the UK, I can't imagine, I don't think I've met anyone who's not heard of The Three Musketeers. It's been propagated by multiple film and TV adaptations. Have you seen, Jacob, the 2014 BBC TV series The Musketeers?
I actually haven't. In fact, I might be one of the few people who, I mean, I have heard of The Three Musketeers, but I've never actually seen or read or listened to any media that tells the story. Yeah, actually, it's just a title to me, but I think I might be in the minority there.
Well, I mean, I've not seen it recently. I don't know how well it stands the test of time to my own aging. You know, I enjoyed the old BBC Merlin TV series, but it's very much sort of a family show. You know, you go back to it and you realise, you know, it's really made accessible for all the ages. Not any critique of the show, of course, but when you're a kid and you're watching some of these shows, they feel like super grand. They're like on a sort of epic scale, awesome, thrilling stories of action and adventure, but they have to be pitched at a level that's sort of acceptable for a younger audience as well. So, no, yeah, I remember enjoying the Musketeers. Anyway, that's just tangential because just to demonstrate that these characters involved before Louis XIV are famous in media as well as for, actually being like very powerful monarchs within Europe in the century leading up to the French Revolution. Spoilers, but don't worry, that doesn't happen in Louis XIV's reign, so any listeners don't have to worry about too many spoilers. But obviously, being so close to the revolution, there is a relationship here. We are talking about a king of France, after all. So, in 1643, our main character, Louis XIV, becomes king of France following the death of his father. However, he's still quite small at this time. Bear in mind, he was born in 1638. It's now 1643. He's not really old enough to be king. So, we have a regency. Now, what his father, Louis XIII, had planned was for a regency council to take over. I didn't go super deep into this, but it appears that the former king lacked faith in Anne, the Queen's political abilities, so he sort of made a contingency plan to institute sort of a collection of sort of nobles and important members of the church to govern instead. But the Queen was shrewd enough because she managed to get the former king's will annulled by the Parliament of Paris. So after all, the regency was just under the rule of Anne of Austria. So what did Anne of Austria do, and how was the life of the young king influenced? Well, I think the most important, possibly important on like a personal level, certainly in relationship with like him and his understanding of politics and the world, there's sort of one main thing to touch upon, and that is this period of turmoil known as the Fronde. Do you know what the Fronde, do you know where the name comes from? Have you heard of the Fronde?
The Fronde does ring a bell, but I wouldn't be able to define it for you off the top of my head. What is the Fronde?
So the term the Fronde itself, I believe, is named after the slings that would be used to smash windows, and the period itself was about 5 years. So it started in 1648. So the king was still pretty young at that time, not even a teenager at the start of it, and various factions challenged the authority of the regency in this period. So Anne, alongside her chief minister, a Cardinal Mazarin, pursued internal affairs with some amount of passion. So she didn't really seem to focus much on foreign affairs. She was interested in augmenting the power of the crown at the expense of nobility and of the parliaments. So she was a strong believer in the divine right to rule, and this does seem to be something that she transferred to the young king, and quite possibly you could see her motivation as sort of for him. She's ruling in this regency period, and she's trying to consolidate power under the crown, which she knows will be passed on to her son within sort of a decade or so. So
This was definitely something that Louis XIV inherited, I think, this belief in the divine right and this distinction where the monarch is not just one of the nobility, but actually squarely above them in the hierarchy, just below maybe the Pope or directly below God himself in the Christian worldview.
Yeah.
Particularly the Catholic worldview.
Yeah. So there are so many things going on in this king's life. I'm not going to go into the sort of political history and details of the Fronde, but I will talk about one more event from it, and you'll see that this may influence a young king. So in February of 1651, when Louis was just 12 years old, it's said that an angry mob broke into the royal palace. So this mob originating from discontented Parisians, and they broke into the royal palace demanding to see the king. So after making their way to his bedchambers, they gazed upon him pretending to sleep, and through whatever magic, I guess, of being a sleeping child, they were appeased and they left without objection. Now, they may not have harmed Louis, but I think with deploying our empathy caps here, if we just take a moment to think about how this might influence you if you are a young king living under a regency, you're just a child and you're in this period where you don't understand everything, but you know that there's some amount of it's not totally secure. You might be seen as one of the most powerful people in the country or the world, but people have just broken into his house, they've broken into where he sleeps, and they would have been able to, had they had the compulsion, to harm him. So I feel like this event must have had some sort of influence on his views, because he later on in life does a few more things to demonstrate his distrust with Paris and with the sort of the concept and the power of the high-ranking aristocrats. It sort of helped consolidate his idea of divine rights, I think, because he just needs to... Well, I'm not sure that he really trusts others in his country. It certainly doesn't trust anyone more than himself, it seems, in decision making. I don't know. What do you think about this story?
I mean, talk about formative experiences, right? I think you're correct. I mean, how old was Louis at this time?
12.
12. So, you're not even a teenager yet, and suddenly, despite nominally being the King of France, you're functionally under a regency, and these random people break into your home, not even to rob anything, but just to stalk you up close, I guess. It's like some strange combination of robbery and voyeurism, and you pretend to be asleep or just too petrified to do anything, and they decide not to kill you, but in a mob kind of scenario where group psychology is ruling the day, that's not a given at all. And then they just leave, and you have to wait until some adults who come into the room and explain what the hell's going on and what just happened, and there's kind of minor civil wars going on at the time. I think particularly if that's contrasted with a close relationship to your mother, who has told you basically for as long as you can remember that you are protected by God's mandation and divine right, and you are not only politically but religiously elevated above all others in this kingdom, which is also yours, by the way, and you will inherit it in a few years' time. Your middle name is literally translated to mean God-given. I think those two polar opposites colliding in the face of a 12-year-old child would be an extremely formative experience, maybe even the apex of their of Louis XIV's childhood. I struggle to see how anything else could be more burned into someone's brain.
No, I think you put that into words very well. I think that's exactly what I see from the pieces of the puzzle that are presented here. So he did eventually become king. Obviously, we've already said he was the longest reigning monarch. He lived quite a long time and was king for quite a long time. And that sort of, well, he's already king, but this assumption of the control of government finally happens in the year 1661. So Louis is 22 years old. And he continues sort of his mother's legacy of centralizing decision-making and sort of quite reluctant to have power rest in the hands of the nobility. So there's some grander concepts that I don't know if I want to explore too much because I don't think I understand them. I imagine there's from what I've read that there's some debate among historians, but this concept of an age of absolutism among European monarchs, that Louis XIV, because he was interested in assuming more total control over his country's governance, that this sort of forms part of a larger pattern that was going on in Europe and influencing the direction of politics. But certainly the portrayal of him in this Wikipedia article is that him and his mother were very interested in taking power from other parts of what used to be in the feudal system and sort of giving them to the crown. So what does he do after that? In 1667 he starts a war. So he's married now to Maria Theresa of Spain, and he wants to press some rights gained from sort of his wife's inheritance. So in the Spanish Netherlands, he wants some territory. So he starts a war. Now he gains a little bit of territory and the war ends just the next year in 1668. 3 years later, Louis declares war another time, this time on the Dutch Republic. So he wants to again expand his influence and sort of weaken his European rivals in some way. But the war sort of burgeons a little bit as multiple coalitions form, hence it's generally referred to as the Franco-Dutch War, and this also prolongs the war. It lasts about 6 years, and there were some territorial gains for France, and the war ended in 1678. Yes, you may notice a growing theme here, because already, he 6 years after taking the throne, I mean, I don't know enough about other monarchs, but 6 years after taking the throne, he starts one war. Few years later, he starts another, and this one did last a while, but he does have his fair share of wars after this as well. So just one more point that I will throw in there before we sort of go over to your side of things. In 1682, Louis moves the royal court. So currently the court is sort of within Paris, but we know a little bit about Louis, and for reasons that we've discussed and possibly some more, he establishes the court in Versailles, and this is sort of seen as a sort of transformation point. He's creating a symbol of absolute monarchy because he's moving the center of political, social, and cultural life in France to this palace in Versailles, as opposed to keeping it within Paris itself.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the construction of Versailles, which was commissioned by Louis and undertaken over many years. I'm not sure how long it took to construct Versailles, but it was done in stages, and it's mentioned that many of the nobility disliked attending court there whilst it was under construction because they thought it looked sort of ugly, and it was 20 kilometers outside of Paris, which doesn't seem like that much today, perhaps because Paris is a lot bigger and we all have cars and trains and so forth, but at the time that was quite far removed really from the traditional centre of French politics. And not only was Paris important on a national level, but at this time Paris was also extremely important on an international level because France was the leading European power. And this period in French history is often called le grand siècle, the kind of the great century, jointly the reigns of Louis XIV and his father Louis XIII, because it's remembered as a time where France was gaining power all the time, was governed reasonably effectively from a sort of international relations point of view, although perhaps not from a French peasant's point of view. And as you mentioned, by the time of Louis XIV's death, he left a country that was flourishing in a degree of debt from the War of the Spanish Succession, but otherwise quite healthy. And so by constructing this Palace of Versailles and moving the court there, I think what Louis was doing was sending a message and cementing this idea that he was in charge of his country. No ifs, no buts, no asterisks. The heart of Paris, where he'd been kind of tormented by these minor civil wars and the political machinations of court and the lesser nobility and the more powerful members of the bourgeoisie and sort of thing, were nullified by holding court at Versailles. And something I did not expect to read in this article was that, on 2 points. Firstly, Louis XIV was personally a great patron of the arts, and particularly a lover of ballet dancing. He was a proficient and very good ballet dancer himself, and the number of performances that he undertook in his lifetime actually approaches the level of a professional ballet dancer, which is interesting by itself. But he used ballet dancing alongside other kind of artistic pursuits in Versailles as a means of distracting the nobility and to get them squabbling with each other, to circumvent all of their string pulling and assert his own divine right as the Catholic King of France. Because in his palace, unlike in Paris, he could instigate quite arbitrary rules for his court. He could say, well, I'm only going to permit certain people to wear the royal colours, which were blue and gold. And so if you want to wear my royal colours at court, then you've got to be in my good books. And so all of the courtiers would be sweating bullets about how they could secure the king's favour so that they might wear these artisanal, tailored blue and gold pieces of clothing that they wanted to show off. Or he might say, well, you have to, witness ballet dancing in this way, or you have to partake in feasting in a certain way. And all of this, from the outside, looks ridiculous and arbitrary. And that was the point, because while the nobility were fighting each other about how to achieve this minor point of Versailles etiquette, Louis could get on with the business of running the country and investing in its infrastructure. Particularly, he was keen to vitalise the economy and built a load of canals that still exist running through France to facilitate national kind of intranational trade. Excuse me. And although he was not progressive to a modern mindset, he was somewhat progressive socially for the time, not to the level that he cared at all about the peasantry or anything, but some of his ministers, particularly later in his reign, were actually not members of the nobility at all, but senior figures in the bourgeoisie, the kind of, wealthy new money classes. And that was unheard of at the time, and would have previously, under his father's reign, resulted in a huge outcry. But he was able to get it all in hand, largely, I think, apparently, thanks to the arbitrary etiquette rules that kept everyone busy in Versailles.
Wow. I mean, that sounds like he had a little bit of a scheming mind there. Sounds like
he. I
mean, as
apparently. Yeah.
Sorry.
He learnt a lot. Sorry, no. There's a bit of a delay here. He apparently learnt a lot from his regent when he was still alive, Cardinal Mazarin. This was the guy who was in charge of running France whilst he was not old enough to rule. Although I think in practice the cardinal just ran until he died himself. So the relationship between them wasn't as sort of cartoonishly stereotypical as you might expect, where like he's just like an evil kind of schemer. I mean, he was a schemer. I make no comment on his personal morality, but he taught a lot of this politicking to Louis XIV, who put it to good use, indeed.
Mm. No, the use of dance as a form of political control is not one that I've... it's not a tool I've heard of before.
Yeah.
So was there anything else you gleaned that, you thought was particularly noteworthy?
Well, I think... there's so much to say. I think really... a good section of this article is actually caught up in the War of the Spanish Succession, which took place from July 1701 to February 1715, and Louis XIV died in September 1715, just after the end of the war. And although the War of the Spanish Succession was extremely important, basically because the guy in charge of Spain at the time, and by extension the Spanish Empire, was Charles II of Spain, who was a Habsburg, and was basically riddled with physical and mental disabilities that left him, among other things, probably infertile. So everyone knew he was dying without an heir. And basically, Ben, it says in Charles II of Spain's article that people were kind of expecting him to be dead from the moment of his birth. And I think he died in his 30s. And that's probably a miracle that he lived even that long, to be honest. Which led to a situation where people wanted to inherit the Spanish Empire. But the two most likely claimants were a guy called Philip of Anjou, who was, I think, Louis XIV's grandson, something like that. Basically, France supported his claim, and this was kind of counteracted by the Holy Roman Emperor and Austria at the time, because they felt that this would give France/Spain way too much power. And Great Britain and Sweden and some of the other European powers were dead set against this being allowed to happen, because it would amalgamate two of the strongest world powers at the time, and it would be a complete political mess. The war goes on for so long, though, that this is between basically France and Spain on the one side, and much of the rest of Europe on the other, which is a massive oversimplification, but that's kind of the basics. It goes on for so long that the Austrian/HRE claimant dies halfway through, and the new guy ends up becoming the Holy Roman Emperor. And so Great Britain and the rest of the coalition realise basically, oh crap, even if we win, we're going to end up in the same situation, just with a union between the German states and Spain, which is, from our perspective, no better. So the coalition kind of collapses, and France does a little bit better at the end, having done very poorly in the beginning of the war. And in the end, Philip of Anjou does keep his title as King of Spain and head of the Spanish Empire, however, signs a treaty that says he renounces his place in the line of French succession, meaning that he won't ever come close to ruling France. And this is sort of good enough for everyone. Some territories are swapped. Great Britain does very well out of it, actually, increases its New World holdings and ends the War of the Spanish Succession with unquestionably the strongest navy, whereas prior to the War of the Spanish Succession it was kind of jostling with Spain and the Dutch Empire, which people kind of forget about, largely because it was decimated in the War of the Spanish Succession. But for Louis XIV, I think the article discusses it too much. The war itself is important, but Louis dies before he really lives to see the major consequences of it. And I would argue that his personal national reforms, which kind of solidified this concept of the ancien régime, the ancient regime, the political class hierarchy in France, it was much more important, because it was this hierarchy that the French people would ultimately rebel against at the end of the 18th century, which led to, of course, the French Revolution, and then by extension Napoleon, and the wars in the early 19th century, ending with the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. And much of that is kind of more directly stemming from these national reforms than the War of the Spanish Succession. So I think it's perhaps a little bit unbalanced in how it discusses events in the later part of Louis XIV's life. Not unbiased, but just spends too much time talking about this international war. But apart from that, he was a patron of the arts, really hated Protestants, like seriously hated Protestants, ended up expelling all of the Protestants, as many as he could, from France, which was terrible because a lot of them were very skilled artisans, and a lot of them fled to Great Britain, and France lost decades of work because they ran out of skilled artisans in some industries. But apart from that, I think that pretty much covers Louis the Great, the Sun King.
Yes, we are sort of wrapping up now. I just wanted to mention sort of one more point before we end things today. That so this Sun King image really comes from his sort of, well, it's like a nickname that he's sort of given himself, kind of. He really liked to liken himself to the Greek god Apollo, which is an interesting pick. You know, this symbol of this god symbol of intellectualism and of the sun. But you know, he was the absolute monarch, so he could sort of do that, and that has sort of led to him being known as the Sun King. And I'm sure he likes the idea of himself sort of being referred to as, in a way, a bit of a god king. But he liked to... So you mentioned the building of Versailles as well. He really did use Versailles in a sort of shrewd political way, in a sort of personal safety way of moving himself sort of slightly out of things, and also in a bit of a flamboyant way, which allowed him to demonstrate his power and have sort of an influence even on morale at times. So he even liked to convey some sense that he was godlike in his power. So by having super impressive gardens, interestingly, you might think that seems a bit, poor taste if there's just been a famine, but actually what this demonstrates, it allows him to say, don't worry, things are tough, but I am powerful and this is what I can do, and our nation will still prosper, we can recover. It's almost, he's sort of creating a mythology around himself, that he's even more powerful than he is.
Interesting. That's sort of almost trying to facilitate a cult of personality. Whilst being so far detached from the majority of his citizens.
I mean, I to be honest, it's, without going into it, it's hard to know when you hear about actions like that whether they actually worked, because I'm not sure that we're going to hear much about peasants having what peasants wrote about these sorts of narratives. We're going to get opinions on it from people that probably thought it was very clever.
Imagine like a Gallup poll of French peasantry in the 18th century. Yeah. What is your opinion on the price of bread?
Yeah. So, I just wanted to shout out on this massive topic, which we've struggled to cover and are running over on, and have still barely touched upon, really. I want to thank Victoria, who is also hopefully still a listener of the podcast, for talking to me a bit about Louis XIV, and she has a Twitter account which you can follow where she talks a bit about history as well. So I encourage you to check that out if these sorts of topics are interesting to you. Otherwise,
grand.
Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.
We'll see you next time.